It's interesting you mentioned one thing that we talked about, which was competence instills trust in the team. Because we talked about how much character allowed the team to trust them. I trust their character. I trust this person is
Sure.
going to do the right thing. But now we've got another characteristic of good leaders and great leaders that really relies on the trust of the team, and that's competence. And I 100% agree with you. How many times do you hear, whether you're the head of the team or a team member, of like someone say, I trust this person. They know what they're doing. Much like we
Right.
talked about, I know they're going to do the right thing when we're talking about character but now we're talking about, well, I know they're going to do the right thing. I know they're going to make the right decision about specifics, like you were saying about competence. How much do you think the being competent really relays into trust versus character? Are they sort of two hands of the same thing?
I don't know, in my mind, it's kind of a different form of trust, maybe. With the character, you trust that someone is going to do the right thing. There's that kind of trust. And so you can allow yourself to be vulnerable in a sense. Whereas with competence, you trust that they're going to get the job done. And you can invest in that. And you're not going to lose some part of your work product or your effort because it was all for naught. Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. On today's episode, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Hamrick. Justin, what are we talking about today?
Well, TC, today we're moving on to the second of the four C's. Today we're going to touch on the second one. And it's a topic that in and of itself could be an entire study or semester of study at any college. But today we're going to talk about competence. So I think we first should get into defining what competence is. So when you think about competence in it, the way it relates to leaders or leadership, what would you say that competence is?
That's a good question, and I agree with you. I think it's always good to define our terms. So I would say that we can define competence as having the knowledge, the skills, the abilities to accomplish something successfully and efficiently. Basically having what it takes to get the job done and not necessarily being the person with the greatest expertise in a particular subject. I think it's important to note, really, kind of there are two forms of competence when it comes to leading. People generally expect their leaders to be an expert in their field. So for physician leaders, in our case, to be an expert physician in the field. For me, it's pediatric cardiology. For you, it's cardiac anesthesiology and critical care. If somebody's an engineer, they're expected to be a competent engineer. That expertise is the price of admission to be considered as a viable candidate for leadership. People need to respect that their leader understands the subject matter and environment they'll be leading in. But again, once that price of admission is covered, another expectation is added, and that is that people expect their leader to actually be competent at leading. And that's sort of where this idea of the Peter principle comes in, where people are promoted to the point where they fail. And so a lot of people are really good at being an engineer or a teacher or whatever role that you might think of, but they don't know how to lead. And that's where that failure happens. So competence, when it comes to leadership, is really this being really good at having the knowledge and skills and abilities to accomplish something in your field, but also being really good at being a leader.
Can you drop? That's a really, really interesting point that I think a lot of people in positions of leadership or management sort of miss, is like, where does expertise stop and competence begin? Because I think we've all known people in our careers who are experts, whether they can't translate the book knowledge to real life or they're really good at, they're an expert in their own field, but when it comes to competence, like really, let's really get into the nuts and bolts of where expertise stops and competence really begins, and what it would even look like.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. And I think that really it is. I think the differentiating factor is expertise on some level is having knowledge, that you're an expert, meaning that you know a lot about something. It doesn't necessarily convey, though it could, it doesn't necessarily convey that you're really good at doing whatever it is. Now, most people would say if you're an expert cardiac surgeon, that means you actually can, you have the technical capability to do the surgeries. But I think that's probably what you're really getting at, right? Is that there's being an expert, really knowing the information and knowing what to do, but competence carries with it the ability to actually get it done and to
Yeah.
get it done well.
I I mean, if I hear what you're saying, it almost seems like competence is the application of expertise. Like, certainly,
I
I've
think
known
that's right.
people in my life or my career that could literally recite the book to you on whatever it is, engineering, particle physics, pediatric cardiology. But when you came to, okay, now apply it, they just could never make that connection. So I guess how does somebody translate that? How does it look like then, like, technically, how does competence look different than expertise?
Yeah, again, I think it's the actual doing.
Hmm.
It's getting it done and doing it well at the end of the day.
Do you think someone can be competent without expertise, or like you were saying, you really think it is a price of admission? You can't even begin to be competent if you don't have the expertise.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I think you have to have some degree of expertise in this. And again, we're kind of getting back to this idea that with leadership, you need competence or expertise in your given field and craft, and then competence in capability to lead. So I think that people expect you to have expertise, but they expect you to be able to actually carry it out and get the job done. So I don't think that you're going to do well with just a bunch of knowledge, but no ability to actualize it.
Do you think someone could be a good leader without being competent, meaning they're really effective motivators of people, like a football coach? Let's say a football coach has never played football, they couldn't actually do it, but they're a really good motivator, like they're a really good leader of the people. Will they ever really be a great leader if they're not competent in the subject they're trying to lead?
Yeah. So question is competence required for good leadership? And my immediate response to that is really who's willing to follow someone who's incompetent? That's the right. Like that's, I mean, I'm not. But let's say we expand on that question a bit. We might ask, aren't there more things to leadership and can't they make up for a lack of competence? Which is really kind of where you're going with talking about
Yep.
the other C's, right? Like with character and caring and communication. What if you're really good at those? I would say that while exceptional character and caring for those we lead are vitally important for leadership, they can't make up for an utter lack of competence. That is, if you're utterly incompetent, people aren't really going to care or be moved by your character and caring so much. People rarely choose to follow someone who's incompetent, certain political or societal figures notwithstanding. On the other hand, a leader with extraordinary competence may sometimes be forgiven for shortcomings of character or a lack of caring for those that they're leading. There's certain roles where we can tolerate, maybe even embrace a lack of competence. Great competence isn't a requirement to be a wonderful grandparent. I never thought about my grandmother's competence, right? But there are some roles where competence is non negotiable. Again, congenital heart surgeons, is an example, airline pilots, electricians. Incompetence in those domains can result in your own death or the death of others. I think that leaders fall into that group, at least leaders who are successful over the long term.
What do you think about the example of, like, let's say a general contractor? General contractor is sort of the leader of a home build, and they need to lead their subcontractors. They may not be true experts in electrical work or plumbing or all the, so much so that they are, but they are called to lead those people. Where, how much expertise in all the individual parts of the team do you think they need versus general knowledge of like how the things work, I guess, and competence of how all those things fit together?
I mean, I guess we'd have to see what their results are, right? Like that's the hard thing. I mean, we can envision that. I think that you have to be able to speak the language proficiently. You have to be really good at the language. You have to know enough about the conduits and the gauge of wiring and how many amps need to be on this switch or how to set up this plumbing system or the HVAC system or whatever it may be, to be able to communicate in a way that the people that you're trying to work with know what you're trying to do and get the job done. So I think you have to be able to speak the language on some level, but I think ultimately you have to have, because it's not possible. Let's say if you're the CEO of General Motors, you're probably not going to know how to put together every single part
Mm-hmm.
of a truck and a car and a van and a whatever. And you're not going to know how to operate the assembly line. And you're not going to know how to do all the spreadsheets that are required. And you're not going to know how to drive the forklifts or all these different components. But you're expected to have some expertise and competence in your given field, whatever it may be, some slice of it. That's the ante. That's the cost of admission. You're not expected to be an expert in everything. So I would say that with regards to the general contractor question, I think people expect you to be really good at, maybe you were a carpenter at some point and then you decided to become a general
Mm-hmm.
contractor. Maybe you were an electrician at some point and you decided to become a general contractor. So you can flex a little bit on your carpentry or your electrical skills or whatever it is. People expect that. That's what I think.
How much of competence do you think is accrued after a leadership position? I think of two examples. One would be the move from the CEO from Chipotle to Starbucks, to pretty different industries and different probably needs and customer bases, but I mean, they're really expecting success from that. The other is in our own industry, routinely a subspecialist will be promoted to a CMO where they were an expert pediatric cardiologist, but now have to oversee the entire children's hospital or even an entire adult and pediatrics hospital, where they may not understand exactly, like you were saying, the needs of the neonatologist or the pediatric surgeon. How much of good leadership is continuing to learn on the job with something like incompetence, where you may not have
Yeah.
training in that, but knowing your people?
I think it's imperative. I think any leader who isn't attempting to grow, if you're not growing, you're dying from a leadership standpoint. So I think all great leaders are lifelong, continuous learners. And I think that if you wait until you're completely, quote unquote, ready for a given position, you've waited too late. Every position should come with the expectation that you're going to grow once you get into it. And so I think that's fundamental to great leadership. I think the people that really, I mean, they're not isolated, but people who really come into a leadership role, thinking they know all the answers and they've got it figured out and so forth, probably the ones who are going to do fairly poorly.
Hmm.
And so this idea that you need to have a growth mindset, you need to keep learning and growing, that even though you may be competent in your field, you may be really quite good at being a leader, you can always be better. You should always strive to be better. Because if you're not growing, you're dying.
How does competence itself impact or develop leadership? Like when you really sort of boil it down to, obviously you need to be good at your specific job, but um, how does competence really fit in with the four C's?
So what I was hearing initially in your question was almost this positive inertia toward becoming a leader. That if someone has competence in their domain, then there's this positive inertia toward leadership roles. I don't know if that's what you were necessarily going toward, but that's what I was hearing early in as you were raising the question. So I'll feel that. I think that that happens. That's sort of a natural byproduct of competence. People want to follow people they trust, know that they can look at somebody and say, that person knows what they're doing and they do it really well.
Hmm.
If they say to do this or that or the other, I can trust that, right? A competence produces trust in other people. They trust that we can get the job done, whatever the job is. And that trust builds relationship. It builds ability to influence those people. And at the end of the day, like we've defined in a previous episode, that ability to influence is the crux of leadership. And so I think that as we have competence, it is a natural byproduct that we do move toward leadership. That doesn't mean that everybody that's competent wants to be in a position of leadership. I think they're still leaders, even though they may shy away from it. They may say, hey, I'm really happy being a programmer or whatever role they have in a given team or organization, but it doesn't mean they're not leading, even though they may not have an administrative or some sort of leadership
Hmm.
title.
I,
But I think
I
that,
think
yeah,
that
I think that is a natural progression.
I think that's 100% true. I mean, how many times like have we heard it on ESPN or something? Like I'm sure when Tom Brady changed teams and walked into the Tampa Bay locker room, because they knew he was competent at his job, he immediately had a group that would follow him. And we've heard on the other side where a quarterback viewed as the leader of a team is viewed as incompetent and how quickly that falls apart. Like, I don't trust what you're doing. So, yeah, I really do think it has that. Have you ever viewed competence as a hindrance to leadership? And let me refine what question I'm saying is
Mm.
when that principle that when we believe we are competent in one area, we think that extends to other areas. Meaning, you come into a job, say, let's a CMO, that you are very good at your particular field, a pediatric cardiologist, and you think because you're good in that you will be good at finances, and you sort of overestimate. You ever feel like competence can actually be a hindrance to people?
100%. Yes, no doubt. So, what you're describing is actually what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay. And
Never heard of
so,
her.
yeah, so that's the last name of two people. And so, what they did was they studied people's how highly they thought of themselves with regards to a given subject matter, and then they tested them on it. And it turns out that the people who really thought that they were great didn't always score really highly. And if you look at it, basically everybody out of the study, they were all above average, right? They were like, it's the Lake Wobegon effect, right? Where all the kids are above average. And so everybody's somewhere around the 60th percentile when they said, okay, compared to everybody else, how well do you know this, or how well can you do this? And so it's somewhere around the 60th percentile. But then if you look at the scores where they test people on this, there's the 25th percentile and the 50th percentile and the 75th and so on. And it turns out that those people who scored the lowest thought they were just as good as the people that scored the highest. So, and the reason is because they attributed knowledge in one domain to a more global
Mm.
capability and knowledge. So we see this all the time in medicine, all the time. In fact, I did a study a couple 3 years ago where I looked at leadership in physicians, and I'd created this tool about leadership and management, and I asked people, how prepared are you to lead compared to physician peers? And then I had them take this test, and I looked at how they scored on the test versus how they thought they would do, how good of a leader they think they are. And Justin, it was phenomenal. Like literally, I could take the graph and overlay it on Dunning and Kruger's original graph. Like it was exactly, I mean, exactly the same. It was insane that the same, the people at the low end thought they were really, really great. And the people at the high end actually thought they were not as good as they really were. Same thing Dunning and Kruger found. So, and look, how many physicians, we may be guilty of the same thing, but how many among our guild think that because we're really good at cardiac anesthesiology or pediatric cardiology or whatever, we have something great to say about, you name it, particle physics, or the environment, or I don't know, pick some topic, right? But everybody's susceptible to that, the
Oh yeah,
Dunning
we
Kruger effect, and we can be sure to, for those who are interested in the Dunning Kruger effect, or even that physician study that I did, we can put that in the show notes.
yeah, it's interesting. I hear from what you're saying that competence does not equal confidence, and confidence does not equal competence. So I want
Yeah.
to delve a little bit more into what you touched on there, which is what's the research behind competence in your studies that you've done and interviewing all these people, these high level military people. What are you finding about competence? Why did it make it into one of the four C's? I mean, obviously it's important, but like what did the research show you of just how important competence is?
Yeah. So I can touch on a number of things here. What I would say is that studies have consistently shown a number of positive effects associated with leaders' competence. If we look at the largest study that's ever been done on leadership, it actually came via the US military after World War II. They looked at over 12 million service members,
Wow.
said, what's the thing that you're looking for in a leader? And phrasing it in a little bit better manner for our listeners who might have younger people in the car or whatever, was that they know their stuff. Okay. You can imagine what stuff actually was in the original, but they know their stuff, right? And so that was far and away, they're competent. That's what they were saying. But I can name several major positive effects right off, and we can come back to maybe three of those individually, and we can include the list of the ones that I can name in the show notes, along with some references for studies for those who are interested. So competence on the leader's part has been associated with increased trust and credibility. I've already mentioned
Hmm.
that a little bit. Improved leader and team adaptability, improved organizational performance, enhanced employee satisfaction and engagement, increased team cohesion and effectiveness, better decision making and problem solving, which can lead to higher degrees of innovation, a positive organizational culture, and a reduced intention to leave. And those are all really, really important for organizations that are trying to excel and be successful and so on. Now, if we go back and pick a few of those to drill down on a little more on the research end, The first is a leader's competence has positive effects on organizational performance, and that makes plenty of sense. An example of a study that looked at this was done by Timothy Judge and his colleagues, and they did what's called a meta-analysis. So they looked at a whole bunch of different studies and really analyzed those all together, and they found that a leader's competence in leading, which they really assessed using what's known as the Big Five personality traits, and that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But anyway, they found that those who had the highest competence based on those factors also had teams with higher degrees of performance. As you might expect, they found those who were higher in neuroticism were associated with worse organizational performance. So competent leaders produce higher performing organizations, and that's because they are better at things like setting clear goals, developing effective strategies, making informed decisions, and those all lead to improved organizational outcomes.
It's interesting you mentioned one thing that we talked about, which was competence instills trust in the team. Because we talked about how much character allowed the team to trust them. I trust their character. I trust this person is
Sure.
going to do the right thing. But now we've got another characteristic of good leaders and great leaders that really relies on the trust of the team, and that's competence. And I 100% agree with you. Like, how many times do you hear, whether you're the head of the team or a team member, of like someone say, I trust this person. They know what they're doing. You know, much like we
Right.
talked about, I know they're going to do the right thing when we're talking about character but now we're talking about, well, I know they're going to do the right thing. I know they're going to make the right decision about specifics, like you were saying about competence. How much do you think the being competent really relays into trust versus character? Are they sort of two hands of the same thing?
It's, I don't know, in my mind, it's kind of a different form of trust, maybe. With character, you trust that someone is going to do the right thing. There's that kind of trust. And so you can allow yourself to be vulnerable in a sense. Whereas with competence, you trust that they're going to get the job done. And you can invest in that. And you're not going to lose some part of your work product or your effort because it was all for naught. That's, as I think about it, that's how I would say that they're multifaceted. It's multifaceted trust in a sense, as I think about it.
Yeah, I mean,
But I had not until this moment really thought about that. For me, some of these things, whether that's born out of having been in the military or the work that I have done and am doing with the generals and the admirals, I always think about if you're in a battle, the thing that you really want is to know that you're coming home. Like that's pretty high on the list, right? Like you want to get the job done, and if that ends up with the worst of outcome for you, that may happen, but you're hoping that your leader can get you home, accomplish the mission, and get home. And so, who is going to charge into battle with a nincompoop, right? Like who voluntarily says that guy's a complete idiot? Here's a high risk operation where we're going to have people who are actively seeking to kill us, and I'm going to follow that clown.
I mean, Band of Brothers had like 10 episodes on that entire topic, I think. I mean, it's interesting. Like, as you were talking, it almost got a little clearer in my mind. I feel like character almost allows you to trust the vision, meaning the direction they're going, I believe in, I trust. Whereas competence, you're going to trust the plan and the strategy. You're right. Character, I trust that the character of this general is to get everybody home. But the competence, I trust he actually knows how to do that, to install a plan or a strategy that's actually going to do it. And I agree now that you sort of elucidated that it's really different trust.
Yeah.
It's maybe
And
different parts
we can
of it.
shift it out of the military sort of mindset and think about it in more of the business domain where if we think about, I don't know, let's say Enron, right? Like
Well, I got to bring up
you,
old stuff.
that's a good example, but you you would have liked to have trusted that the people at the top knew how to do the job well. That's one part of the trust, but you also like to trust that they're going to do it the right way. And it gets back to doing the right thing the right way for the right reasons that we talked about before. But it's that, right? Like there's trust is at least has two parts in that regard. Trust that they're going to do the right thing and trust that they actually know how to do the thing that needs to be done.
All right, TC, you mentioned a bunch of those studies. I want to delve into two more outside of trust. One is team cohesion. I'm really interested in that, especially because of team dynamics. But how does competence, what does the research say that competence does for team cohesion? How does the competence of a leader, keep teams together?
Yeah. So studies have absolutely shown that. There was a study by Steven Zaccaro and his collaborators where they looked at what they call functional leadership, and they were looking at various leadership dimensions associated with team dynamics. They found that teams were more cohesive and effective if they were led by leaders who scored higher in those leadership dimensions, indicating they were more competent. And so leaders who are competent at leading are able to facilitate better communication, resolve conflicts, and ensure team members work together more effectively. And so that really that brings together this idea of cohesion because everyone's communicating and interacting in a better manner. And then as a result, everybody's working together and they're more effective.
It's almost like the opposite of when everybody hates the leader. They're sort of united because they're like, well, we all hate them together. But when you all trust someone, it's almost like it brings the team together because you all know you've got a competent leader, like you were saying in the military. We all know this person's going to get us home or has the best chance to get us home. One other thing you mentioned in the research of competence and leadership is how it decreases people leaving the team, which is huge right now, especially after COVID and so many people changing jobs. How does a competent leader keep people from leaving the team?
Yeah, this idea of it decreases what we would call intent to leave. And so, yeah, I agree. This is extraordinarily timely and vitally important because we're facing across our nation sweeping discontent in organizations. And I would say that nowhere is that greater than among physicians. In March, my colleagues and I published a paper on some key drivers for intent to leave among pediatric physicians. We can include that in the show notes. But this really is an important one. So when we look at leadership competence and its effect on intent to leave, Bruce Avolio, who's published quite a bit in this sort of space, and his colleagues looked at what they called authentic leadership as a measure of leadership competence. And they found that when they perceived their leaders as competent and supportive, employees were more likely to stay with their organization. Given the large amount of turnover in recent years, what's been called again this idea of the great resignation, data like those from Avolio would seem to be really strong reasons for leadership training, development, and further learning to try to improve people's leadership capabilities, because as a result, it can decrease the tendency to leave organizations.
And that's huge, especially when, I mean, there's only so much vacation you can give people, only so much you can raise their salary. What are especially for organization, what are the things that we can do, the sort of low-hanging fruit to keep good people, It seems like having competent leaders is one of the huge ones. So I guess like we've talked a little bit about why competence is so important, both from the research and just from observation of two guys. But I guess you know, the boots on the ground, how does a leader become competent? Like, or how do they, like you said, how do they get better every day? So how do we get better tomorrow than we are today? So how do we do this?
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of ways that one can become more competent as a leader. I think the the first thing is actually wanting to be, a desire to be better, admitting that there is room for growth to be a better leader, and then investing in that in a number of different ways. So if we look at the things that actually improve one's performance as a leader, there are several things that have been shown to work. The first is personal dedication to improving your leadership capabilities through formal and informal pathways. So reading, listening to podcasts, watching
Such as this one.
videos, yeah, just like the science of leadership, where people are pouring into you, helping you to understand important leadership concepts where you can draw on those when a moment comes. I think those things, reading books, probably, even though I write scientific papers on leadership, most people aren't going to be getting a lot of personal leadership development from those kind of papers. Those are more in the theory space, but the concepts that come from them and understanding those concepts are things that people could carry with them. And so that's what we try to do on this podcast, is try to give people the concepts so that they can take those, put those in their leadership toolbox. And so this idea of developing a leadership toolbox, that you have these capabilities, understanding the psychology of the people that you're working with, actually studying that, learning about those concepts, all the biases that we have, whether it's the Dunning-Kruger effect that we talked about earlier, confirmation bias, all those sorts of things. But a commitment to personal development, that's one thing that's really important, been shown to be helpful. And again, that can be formal, informal. I did a master's degree in leadership. I'm about to start a PhD in educational leadership at the end of this month. And so those sorts of things to try to help build your armamentarium. Secondly, is the practical, getting out there and doing it. It's the hands-on. It's the where the rubber meets the road of interacting with those you're trying to lead, or those that you would potentially lead or like to lead, and using those concepts, trying them out. Maybe you fail a little bit here, you succeed a little bit there, but you learn along the way so that you're developing that capability as you move forward. A third thing that's really highly valuable, and this has been shown not only in studies but of different kinds, but also when I studied the 4 stars, and also a study that I did in physician leaders, mentors, people who have gone before you, who have the experience, who can tell you, hey, look, you may want to think about these things. You may want to polish this area of your leadership, or things like that, who can actually speak into your performance and help you to develop those skills and think about leadership in a more formed manner. So those are 3 big things that I think people can do practically to develop and become better
Hmm.
leaders.
And I'm struck by when you talk about all this, it's just how important humility is in competence. And I know you elaborate on this a lot in your book, but knowing that you need to be better, like knowing that you don't have everything, that you do want to seek out mentorship, you want to seek out getting better, like humility is so key into that. So where can our listeners go and find more resources about competence and the science of it and the research in it and how to get more competent as a leader?
Some of those resources we'll put in the show notes, some of the papers mentioned briefly. We'll put those down there so that folks can look into those if they like. Otherwise, there are so many books on the market, and most of the books that are on the market really focus on a singular aspect of leadership, or maybe just a handful of things. So I think that gives one the opportunity to kind of look at, okay, where am I? What do I need to improve on? What are the concepts I need to work on more? And then go out there and maybe select some things. So I think there are a host of books that are out there. The book, The Leadership Challenge by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, that one's got a good deal of conversation, if you will, about competence and some of the key factors to successful and effective leadership. So that's one that comes to mind right off. I'll tell you a book that I really appreciate, and I think that anyone who would want to be a leader should consider it, even if they have no interest in military things, is the U.S. Army's Leadership Field Manual. That really covers in a very systematic way how to think about leadership. What are all the components of leadership? They give examples. Obviously, they're military examples, but it really, they do a great job in that book on covering a lot of ground fairly concisely. And so I think that I would recommend that book to folks. That's in my top 10 of the all the leadership books that I've read. That's one I really would encourage people to think about. Again, whether or not they have any interest or so forth with regard to military. The United States military has been developing leaders for 270 years, so they really have it down as well as any entity on earth when it comes to developing leaders. I think there's a lot that we can learn there. I think those are some examples of resources people could tap
Well,
into.
I feel like we've only really scratched the surface on competence. And I know we're going to have future episodes where we really get into more of the nuts and bolts of what are the various aspects of competence. How do those various aspects look in leadership, and how can people improve? Yeah. But this has been a really great start on the topic. I look forward to future episodes getting really into the nuts and bolts of what competence looks like and the 4 C's.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.